She poisoned her sister, took her crown, and the people celebrated her for it. In an age where royalty meant divine right, one woman dared to rewrite fate not with diplomacy, but with betrayal. She didn't hide in the shadows. She ruled in broad daylight, bathed in blood and worship. Her name was whispered with both fear and admiration. Historians debate whether she was a monster or a savior. But one thing is certain, she rose to power over her sister's corpse and kept it. But how did she get away with it? Why did no one stop her? Today, we enter one of history's darkest royal chambers to uncover the woman who committed the ultimate sin and was crowned for it. This is not just a story of ambition, it's a story of power, myth, and the terrifying ease with which blood can wash into gold. Before the blood, before the crown, before the betrayal, there was a kingdom on the edge of change. The year was 1544. The empire was vast, glittering and volatile. The royal palace sat nestled in a valley of gold-trimmed temples and choking incense, its silken drapes shielding power plays that could make or break dynasties. This was a world where a woman's body belonged to the throne before it belonged to herself, and where love, loyalty and lineage were constantly rewritten by whispers behind fans. Our story begins in one of the lesser-known but no less ruthless courts of Southeast Asia, in a kingdom where women could rule but only if they fought for it. This was not medieval Europe. Here, queens were warriors, advisors, spiritual icons and sometimes executioners. The land was ruled by the royal family of the House of Suryavong, a lineage said to be chosen by the gods. The monarch was seen as semi-divine, the human embodiment of heaven's will. To disobey the ruler was not just treason, it was sacrilege, and to wear the crown was to carry the burden of divinity itself. The reigning queen at the time, Queen Anida, was graceful and beloved, ruling with a steady hand. She had two daughters, both legitimate, both beautiful, and both dangerous. The elder, Princess Aluma, was the favored heir. Known for her poetic grace and spiritual piety, Aluma was the face of tradition, but her younger sister, Sarita, was fire. Charismatic, calculating, and untamed, Sarita was loved by the common people and feared by the nobles. She rode horses like a warrior, spoke openly at court, and questioned rituals that had stood for centuries. While Aluma was groomed for the throne, Sarita grew wild in its shadow. And yet, they were close, at least in appearance. They shared chambers, secrets, tutors, and silks. They prayed together, played together, and performed royal rituals as sisters. But beneath that shared veil of nobility, a storm was building. What made their bond even more fragile was the nature of succession. In this kingdom, the throne did not always go to the eldest. The High Council, comprised of generals, priests, and noble elders, held the power to name the next monarch. Their decision could be swayed by politics, war, visions, or omens, and whispers had begun to rise among them. Perhaps Sarita, the younger sister, had more of the divine flame than Aluma. This was a dangerous idea, because in this court, power was not simply inherited. It was seized, it was defended, it was justified with blood. At night, the palace halls were lit with oil lamps that cast long shadows across the marble floors. The scent of jasmine and rot hung together in the air, perfume over decay. Every noble smiled with painted lips, but kept poison tucked in their sleeves. Every banquet was a battlefield in silk. Every blessing from the temple could be reversed with a whispered curse. And the two princesses were walking toward the center of it all. To understand how Sarita could kill her sister and still be loved, we must first understand the world that taught her betrayal was survival, and that the gods sometimes smiled on those bold enough to commit it. In Sarita's kingdom, power was not inherited. It was earned or stolen. From the outside, the court was a dazzling theater of order. Gold-threaded banners fluttered in the breeze, priests chanted in incense, filled temples, and royal scribes recorded every sunrise as a gift from the gods. But beneath that elegance was a brutal truth. Nothing was sacred except survival. Laws in this realm were less about justice, more about control. There was no constitution, no codified system of rights. The monarch's will was law, and it could change with the wind, a whisper. Dissent was heresy. Accusation was often punishment enough. And trials? Trials were for the theatre. Guilt was a performance, and confession was often purchased with fear. Women in power were celebrated, but only if they played by the rules. Smile sweetly, rule quietly, and never outshine a man in public. Even queens had to balance their authority against the wrath of the High Council, the whispers of priests, and the egos of generals. To step out of line was to invite scandal. To be bold was to be dangerous. And to be ambitious, that was practically suicidal. Yet, Sarita Young, magnetic, unapologetic, was all of those things. She didn't just want influence, she wanted the throne, and everyone knew it. The punishments of this kingdom were medieval in their creativity. Stealing grain could cost you a hand. Questioning a royal decree could earn you exile, branding, or worse. Traitors were bound in cages hung from city gates, their bones picked clean by crows. And poison? Poison was everywhere. It was the silent killer passed in tea, hidden in fruit, or smeared on the rim of ceremonial goblets. To grow up in this court was to learn that every smile could conceal a blade. Loyalty was a currency traded in secrets, and betrayal was not only expected, it was rewarded if done correctly. The royal palace was divided into invisible zones of influence. The army answered to the war minister, who feared the nobles. The nobles paid tribute to the temples, who in turn claimed to speak for the gods. And the gods, conveniently, always favored those who funded the right festivals. Into this dangerous balance stepped the two sisters. Aluma the elder knew how to obey the script. She spoke in proverbs. She prayed publicly. She surrounded herself with old, careful men. She was safe but uninspiring. Sarita, she laughed too loud, danced with soldiers, spoke with foreigners. She studied military strategy instead of embroidery. She quoted philosophy instead of scripture. She frightened the council and fascinated the people, and that made her lethal. In a court built on fragile alliances and unspoken pacts, Sarita broke the mold, and in doing so, she also broke the rules that kept her alive. The only reason she hadn't yet been married off or quietly exiled was her popularity and her potential. Behind palace doors, members of the council debated her fate. Some wanted to strip her of her titles, others wanted to marry her off to a distant province. A few, bolder ones, whispered of accidents. But Sarita was always one step ahead. She had learned the rules not to obey them, but to bend them until they snapped. She understood that in a system designed to crush bold women, the only way to win was to become something even more terrifying than the rules themselves. A queen, and for that, her sister would have to die. The night it happened, the palace was quiet. A full moon hung low over the royal gardens, casting pale light across the lotus ponds and stone walkways. Wind whispered through the silk banners lining the halls, but inside the court held its breath. The palace was preparing for a ceremony, a private ritual just before the High Council was to officially name Crown Princess Aluma as heir to the throne. But the ceremony never came. Sarita had been waiting for this moment, her entire life, not just the death of her sister, but the acceptance of it. If she killed Aluma too soon, she would be branded a murderer. Too late, and the crown would slip forever from her reach. The timing had to be perfect, the night before succession, the moment before history could be written, and so she wrote her own. Earlier that day, Sarita had appeared composed. She kissed her sister's cheek in the garden, walked beside her during prayers, shared sweet tea under the temple of ancestral mercy. But the tea was not sweet. Aluma had been feeling ill for hours. Her head ached, her stomach twisted, and by nightfall she could barely stand. By the time the palace physicians were summoned, her skin had gone pale, her lips dry and cracked. Her eyes, those soft, kind eyes, turned towards Sarita one final time. And though she said nothing, something in her gaze understood. The official story was sudden illness, but nothing was ever sudden in Sarita's palace. She had prepared every detail. The poison had been imported months earlier from a distant land. The servant who delivered the cup had disappeared, his body never found. The physician who signed the death certificate was granted land and a title. And the mourning period? It was short, too short. Within 2 weeks, Sarita stood before the High Council, veiled in white, her voice trembling as she spoke of loss and duty. "I never wanted this," she said, eyes glistening with tears, "but I will carry the burden she left behind." And the council, weary and fragmented, bowed. What choice did they have? Many had grown tired of Aluma's slow deliberations, her endless rituals, her devotion to tradition. Sarita, though controversial, promised strength, order, momentum. She had the army, she had the people, she had the narrative. At the coronation, doves were released into the sky. The people cheered. The banners changed overnight. The temples sang her name in sacred hymns. But beneath it all, the palace floor where Aluma had collapsed was still stained. Whispers began to spread almost immediately. Some said the gods would curse Sarita. Others claimed she had offered sacrifices in secret temples to bind fate to her will. A few brave souls questioned the timing, the physicians, the strange disappearance of the teacup servant. They vanished. Sarita had learned that to rule was not just to hold power, but to erase those who threatened it. She wasn't cruel for cruelty's sake. She was efficient, strategic, necessary. To the outside world, she was the people's queen. She lowered grain taxes, reopened trade routes, punished corrupt nobles, built schools for girls, reformed land laws. In the capital, her statues were sculpted beside the gods she once claimed to serve. And the people, many of whom had hated the rigid traditions of the past, worshipped her. She was seen in the markets. She listened to merchants. She danced during festivals. She rode horses through the countryside, unguarded, smiling. But inside the palace, shadows grew longer. Sarita had nightmares. Her sleep, once sound, became a battlefield. In her dreams, Aluma returned, not angry, not vengeful, but watching, saying nothing, just staring. Eyes full of the same question the people were too afraid to ask. Was it worth it? She would wake up drenched in sweat, clutching the pendant that once belonged to her sister, a trinket she wore every day as remembrance. Each morning, she'd rise again as queen, adored, untouchable, alone. Because in gaining everything, she had lost the only person who truly knew her, not as ruler, not as rival, but as a girl in the garden, laughing beneath the apricot tree. And though she never spoke of Aluma again, her policies told the story. She erased her sister from official records, commissioned new paintings of royal succession where Aluma's figure was curiously absent. She replaced her name in the ancestral temples, rebranded holidays once dedicated to Aluma's mother, and rewrote the kingdom's calendar to mark her own rise as year one of renewal. The crown fit her perfectly, but it had teeth. And every night, when the palace halls emptied and the incense burned low, she would walk alone down the marble corridors toward the locked room where Aluma once slept. No one knew what she did there. No one dared to ask. Only one thing was certain. She had killed her sister to take the throne, and the world had let her. For a time, the kingdom flourished. Queen Sarita's rule brought rapid reforms. Trade increased, crime fell, and the army grew strong under her personal command. To the outside world, she was the perfect monarch, wise, decisive, and impossibly charismatic. Even foreign emissaries began calling her the Golden Lioness, a name she embraced. But behind the gold, the cracks began to show. In the capital, murals of Queen Aluma were painted over. Temples once built in her honor were rededicated. Priests who spoke her name during prayer were quietly replaced. The people whispered, but never too loudly. Everyone remembered what happened to those who whispered too loudly in Sarita's kingdom. Despite this silencing, the memory of Aluma refused to die. Old women left flowers at the garden gate where she once walked. Servants folded her name into temple incense offerings. Songs written in her honor resurfaced, hummed quietly in the alleys during rainstorms. Even the children, born after her death, grew up with ghost stories about a gentle queen poisoned by her own blood. Sarita saw it all, and she hated it, because for all her power, she could not control memory. As the years passed, her popularity remained high. She was loved, but also feared. That love was conditional, always in danger of curdling into suspicion. So she built monuments, declared new holidays, launched military campaigns, anything to keep the kingdom focused forward, anything to outrun the shadow of the past. But shadows are patient. One night, during the festival of ancestral flame, a child approached Sarita with a lotus flower and said softly, "This is for your sister." The queen froze. The child was rushed away. No punishment followed, but from that night onward, Sarita's speeches became colder, her decrees stricter, the palace guards doubled. Something inside her had shifted. The High Council, once so quick to crown her, began to grow wary. A few members who had supported her rise died mysteriously, one from a fall, one from poisoned tea, one found drowned in a bath he never entered. Others simply retired and left the capital altogether. The council became quieter, obedient, and terrified. As for Sarita, she became more isolated. She spoke less, she laughed less. The queen who once rode horses among her people now stayed cloistered behind silk screens and lacquered doors. Rumors spread of sleepless nights, of voices in the halls, of candles burning long after the palace had gone dark. She was alone, glorified, untouchable, and haunted. The irony was cruel. She had killed her sister to secure her future, but in doing so, she had ensured that no one would ever truly stand beside her again. Every ally saw her as a threat. Every servant feared becoming the next ghost, and every citizen knew that their love was not freely given, but carefully performed. Because even though no one dared to say it, everyone remembered the truth. The crown was soaked in blood, and blood always leaves a stain. The story of Queen Sarita did not end in flames or rebellion. There was no dramatic fall, no coup, no final justice. She ruled until her death. And when she died, the people wept, some sincerely, others because it was expected. Officially, she was remembered as the Reformer Queen, the Unifier, the Lioness of the East. Her name was etched in gold on palace walls. Her tomb was the largest ever built for a woman in the kingdom's history. But history has two faces. In hidden corners, stories whispered a different truth, that she rose not by right, but by blood, that her greatness was built on the silence of a sister, that her crown was never truly hers. And maybe that's the most chilling part, that someone could murder her own flesh and blood and still be remembered as a legend, that the world could know what she did and still love her. In the end, what does that say about power? About justice? About us? Because Sarita's story isn't just a tale from a distant kingdom. It's a reflection of every system that rewards ambition over kindness, of every ruler who rewrites memory to hide a crime, of every time the world chooses strength over truth. If you had lived in Sarita's time, what would you have done? Would you have raised your voice, knowing it could cost your life? Or would you have smiled, bowed, and handed her the flower? Would you have honored the murdered queen, or worshipped the one who wore her crown? And to the centuries later, when we walk through our own world of power, spectacle, and silence, do we still choose the louder voice, the prettier lie? This story may be over, but the question it leaves behind still lives. Dark history doesn't always end in blood. Sometimes it ends in applause, and that, perhaps, is the darkest ending of all.